Welcome everyone to another Dolphin Communication Project webinar. This is a deep dive and we are very excited to have Dr. Malin Lilly with us. The title of her talk you can see is Learning from Longitudinal Research on Beluga Sexual Behavior, in particular implications for welfare and conservation. Dr. Lilly has published on behavior and cognition of many different species, including sea lions, harbor seals, rough-tooth and bottlenose dolphins, and of course the beluga whales that you will hear about today. She is an assistant professor at Texas A&M University in Central Texas. She's also part of the Marine Mammal Research Network, which you can learn more about at marinemammalresearch.org. A reminder to anyone who's listening live, this is being recorded. Please submit your questions to the chat, and we will get to the Q&A at the end. And everyone who's listening to the recording, thank you very much for joining. And with that, I will pass it over to Dr. Lilly.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll go ahead and share the PowerPoint here. Maybe we'll share the PowerPoint. Okay, does that look good for everyone?
Looks excellent.
Awesome. Okay, so thanks for being here and taking the time in the middle of your Fridays, or if you're watching this recording later online, which might be you, thanks for clicking on the video that DCP has posted. I am going to talk today about a little amalgamation of our studies from my colleagues and myself over the past several years. If you've been to previous DCP webinars, my colleagues Heather, Jackson, and myself have posted videos in the past, and most of those have focused on a specific study. So today I'm going to mention each of those studies, but kind of provide an overview and talk about why this longitudinal research and sort of the series of studies is so important for both welfare and conservation. So that's the goal today. If you'd like to go back and dig a little bit more into those specific studies, you're welcome to. And of course, please ask any questions. I would love to talk about this all day if I could. Before we go any further, I need to thank all of my collaborators. So this is not possible with Dr. Heather Menezes-Hill, who had the foresight to start this longitudinal study, but also our colleagues Jackson and Katie, and all of the students over the years who have helped make this project possible, collect data, be part of data analysis efforts. And then a longitudinal project like this would not be possible without a collaborator. And so that collaborator primarily today is SeaWorld of Texas. They have a relatively stable, long-term social group of belugas that has a lot of mixed age, sex animals. And so that social group is very important to be able to study these long-term questions. So without their support for our research, we wouldn't know what we know today. And hopefully we'll learn a lot more that we can share with you in the future. So thank you to everybody involved. So the question is, what do we know about the sex lives of belugas? Like any comparative psychologist, or biologist, we often compare back to species that we do know a lot about. So in many cases, we're going to talk about bottlenose dolphins and how belugas may be similar or different to bottlenose dolphins. It is important to keep in mind, though, that belugas are their own species. That means, they share an evolutionary past. There could be similarities, but we can't just assume what's happening with bottlenose dolphins is happening with all other species, including belugas. So what sorts of questions are we going to talk about? The first question I get asked a lot is, do belugas mate for life? Do they have a soulmate? The answer to that is no, they're not monogamous. They are definitely not just sticking with one sexual partner for their lives. Do they have a mating season? Yes, they do. Typically the spring months, maybe a little bit into early summer. Is their sexual behavior limited to reproductive partners? Absolutely not. No one's off limits. And they have a lot of different sexual partners. And why do we care? So first off, as biologists or psychologists or whoever you are watching, you probably care because maybe this is interesting to you. But I'm hoping to convince you by the end of the presentation as well that we should care for the welfare of the animals and we should care for the conservation of beluga stocks in the wild as well. So if belugas are a new species for you, Just to provide you a little bit of background, they are toothed whales. The adults can reach up to 18 feet and up to 4,000 pounds, although the males are typically larger than the females when they're sexually mature adults. The females sexually mature a little bit earlier than the males. And when belugas are born, they're typically a dark gray color, and they typically become whiter as they mature, although this is genetic. So there are some individuals who are fully grown adults who tend to be a little bit more gray in their skin pigment. But that is a way to sort of tell as they're maturing, that whitish color. So where do belugas live? I do my best to educate folks that they live in the Arctic. Not Antarctica. So they live in the Arctic around the North Pole. So this map here is us looking down at the Arctic ice cap. Of course, this ice cap is going to extend and recede depending on the season, but belugas are living all in these light blue colored areas here. So very, very cold waters. In the summer months, they tend to congregate in shallow waters near shore. And they can congregate in large groups, so sometimes hundreds or thousands of individuals. Large groups of belugas. Being in this shallow water, there's obviously the potential for lots of social interactions. And here is where a lot of folks are actually observing them, and more so these days with drone technology, because using drones, able to get those aerial footage and see sort of what the belugas are doing during this time of year. But the water isn't always so clear as this. And then also, when they go off into non-summer months outside these shallow water areas, what are they doing? And so we know a bit less about what they're doing the remainder of the year. Some tracking studies are able to sort of follow where they are, but of course, the social interactions, the part that I'm most interested in, and we're talking mostly about today, the specific social interactions, that's what we don't know a lot about. So like I said, these aerial photographs are becoming more common now that we have this new accessible technology. But even in a scenario such as this, when this image is taken, unless these individuals have been photo identified, it's unclear if this is a male and a female, or probably two males, and what they're doing, and are they in a stable social group together? And then, of course, if they're more than just a few feet below the surface, we probably won't be able to see them at all. So what are they doing out there? We know belugas are reproducing. They create offspring, but some populations are actually having a problem with that. So when I showed you the map, there's a lot of different populations or stocks, subpopulations of belugas around the Arctic. Some of those are very distinct populations, so they're not really overlapping with other populations of belugas. And some of them, for example, the Cook Inlet belugas in Alaska, or the St. Lawrence estuary belugas, aren't recovering, even though they're given a lot of protections. So their populations aren't recovering. And we need to ask, why aren't those populations recovering? And so lots of researchers are investigating this, and there could be lots of potential components to this. So sound pollution, chemical pollution, more boat traffic. But when all of these anthropogenic impacts are happening, it could potentially affect the behavior and the actual reproductive behavior of the belugas. And so this could be one piece to the puzzle, but if we don't know about what belugas are doing in terms of their sexual behavior and reproductive behavior, we have a lot harder time figuring out how those different sort of anthropogenic impacts might affect them. And so hopefully by learning a little bit more, we can just add one more little piece to the puzzle there. So let's talk a little bit about the studies I'm going to refer to today. The research that I'm talking about today from my colleagues and myself is mostly based at the SeaWorld of Texas. Over 10 calves now, we have some new calves lately, have been observed over their development, although the data today is mostly focused on those 10. The video recordings were begun in 2007, so these individuals have been followed their entire lives. Which leads to this longitudinal, able to follow an individual as they grow up. Who are their social partners? How are they developing these behaviors? Looking at specific milestones. And you can look in terms of play, and there's lots of papers that have come out about that. But specifically, the sociosexual behavior is what we're interested in focusing on for this specific webinar. So vocal follows scan samples, but that video evidence is critical to knowing the developmental patterns that we can look at. And then even some of the adult patterns as well. So I'm going to mention sociosexual behavior a lot. And so I think we should talk a little bit about the definition here. Again, in case you are new to this topic, I say it fast and it could kind of be confusing. So sociosexual behavior, we're going to define this as non-conceptive sexual behavior. So any behavior that's not leading directly to reproduction. So this could be between immature animals. This could be sex during non-breeding seasons. It could be two animals of the same sex, which is what we'll see a lot with the belugas. So why would animals, we could ask any species, right? Why would any species engage in sex if it's not leading to reproduction? There could be lots of reasons for this. So one reason could just be it is fun or pleasurable. But when we ask, could it be for fitness benefits? It could be. It could be for fitness benefits and because it's fun. Could be all of the above. So one reason why this could maybe improve fitness is to help practice motor behaviors. The belugas are engaging in sexual behavior for reproduction or not in this very aquatic 3D environment. So it's not a 2D land situation where there's a ground that they're running on or walking on, right? It's this 3D environment where they could move in any given direction at any time. And so that could be very tricky in terms of making sure that they're actually mating and reproducing later on in life. To be able to hit a target accurately, it's perhaps that a lot of motor practice will help them with this. It's also possible, in addition to that, or in place of that or both, that social bonding is occurring. So if the animals are spending a lot of time with each other in social interactions, and maybe they're engaging in sex as a form of either play or some sort of just companionship behavior, that leads to stronger social bonds, and stronger social bonds can increase fitness for maybe a number of reasons as the animals mature. So we know that sociosexual behavior is seen in other species, perhaps most famously in bonobos or chimpanzees, but also lots of other species that we don't hear about every day, right? Maybe rats, mice. And so my colleagues and I were interested in looking at cetacean species more specifically. So this is called a cladogram. It displays the cetacean species. Shout out to Jackson for taking the lead on creating this beautiful image here, all the way from the large baleen whales to the beaked whales, around to the toothed whales. So looking at all of the cetacean species, these shapes, squares, triangles, circles, are filled in if the behaviors have been observed in that given species. And so we don't need to get into the nitty-gritty of this because we're supposed to be talking about belugas today, but just in general, sociosexual behavior is very common among cetacean species. And actually, my office has an eco sensor that if I'm not here or moving, it wants to save electricity. Okay. So we wanted to know if this is just due to some species not engaging in sexual behavior. But what we found is it's actually related to research effort. So as more research articles have focused on any given species over time, it's more likely that sociosexual behavior has been observed. So this just likely means that these other species are probably engaging in sociosexual behavior to some extent, but we just haven't observed them as much or enough. Oh, look, Heather is here. Okay. Or enough, and that probably eventually we'll be able to observe and document what is going on with all of these different species. So it is widespread. And if you want to know more, not just about belugas, maybe belugas aren't your favorite animal in the world, that's okay, although it'd be sad. My colleagues and I, including Kathleen on the call and Heather and Jackson here, we have 2 book chapters actually in this book. You could buy the hard copy if you want, but the whole book is free to download. And if you don't even want to go to the trouble of Googling it, you could just email me and I will email you the book chapters we've written about different cetacean species. So maybe I'll get some emails from you later. So let's turn back, focus on belugas. So what are belugas doing? Well, based on some of those studies looking at wild populations, some belugas split off after they're in those huge congregations in the summer, and some are forming all-male bachelor groups. So when these males go off, adult males by themselves for some period of the year, what are they up to? Hopefully, as time goes on, we'll be able to know more and more about that. But what we can see from animals in professional care is that often the males are engaging in a lot of sex with each other. So again, taking that comparative sort of lens, could this be similar or different to what bottlenose dolphins are doing? Perhaps. So bottlenose dolphins in some populations, so for example, Shark Bay, Australia, are known to form these alliances where there's a group of 2 or 3 males, and they have a lot of synchronous behavior, like we can see in this top image here. They spend a lot of time with each other. They might forage together. They might have sex with each other. And then they also might work together to cooperatively herd and mate with females when they're sexually receptive as well. And so what's interesting is a recent study has been published, Holmes 2024, and colleagues, that the younger males, when they're younger, the more they play and practice play herding and taking on these actor roles, they are actually more successful at fathering offspring later in life. And so that kind of speaks to the hypothesis we talked about earlier, that actually engaging in some of these play or sociosexual behaviors might end up improving fitness later in life. So what does beluga sociosexual behavior look like? So when we're looking for this behavior, it's mostly between males, but males of different ages, although we won't exclude females. We'll talk a little bit about them as well. And it's a repertoire of behaviors. So there could be these S postures. We'll talk more about S postures, where the belugas are sort of making this S with their body. It's a little bit of a static hold. Where they're kind of keeping themselves in that position. Genital rubs, a little bit of a pelvic thrust, although usually not as vigorous as can be seen in many bottlenose dolphins. Sometimes they're opening their mouths, blowing bubbles, producing bubbles, we'll see from different areas, and also moving their melon into different shapes, which we are learning more and more about. So here is your example video we're going to watch here. This is Oliver, the larger, whiter animal. He is in that sort of S posture. He has his little pec fin in the air. He does have an erection there. He did a pelvic thrust towards Samson. He is producing a bubble trail, and he was manipulating his melon. So Oliver and Samson are going to come up to the surface and take a breath there. Notice they're still hanging out by each other. This is just one little snippet. This could go on for some period of time, so maybe even 20 minutes, but it's usually reciprocal. So Samson would repeat this back to Oliver, Oliver back to Samson, Samson back to Oliver, and it could go on, like I mentioned, maybe for 20 minutes or longer. Sometimes it might just last 30 seconds or a minute, but they could spend a lot of time in this sort of reciprocal interaction back and forth. I've shown you an example that's sort of clear to see of 2 animals engaging here. But as I mentioned, SeaWorld of Texas has a relatively large, stable population of belugas. And so it's not just always 2 individuals. Sometimes there's 3 or more because there's lots of different social groupings that are possible. And so in this image here, we see the juveniles. They are sort of snuggled up, spooning, if we want to use anthropogenic language. But if we don't, they are pressed up against each other along the bottom of the habitat. They are rubbing on each other. This is the adult male. In this image, he's over here, but he actually has been seen to swim down and join them in whatever this sort of configuration is. Lots of rubbing going on between them down there. And in this image here, this is what I call a triple-decker bus. Each of these young males is doing a genital rub on the dorsal ridge or the back of the one below it. And so here they're sort of near the front of the habitat, so we have a nice image. But they will just swim around sometimes like this, where they're all sort of rubbing on each other. And then sometimes it's pelvic thrusts in all sorts of directions from a number of individuals. Sometimes 5 or 6 belugas are in the mix, and it's a lot to keep track of when that happens. So not so simple as just always 2 individuals, but again, it depends on the population, because in this population, there are enough individuals where there's many combinations that are possible. So how does this develop? So Jackson took the lead on a lot of these very early developmental studies. And so basically, it starts out looking like play behavior. So very young calves rubbing their genital area on the mother's dorsal ridge. and then potentially rubbing on objects or the environment, but it looks very, very playful. Eventually, they're contorting their bodies into that S posture. And so this we found develops in a piecemeal fashion. And so the young belugas that are small, right, they're starting to try to keep up with that other individual, potentially put their little pectoral fin in the air and try to roll onto their side. Then they try to create sort of S posture with their bodies, although they look pretty clumsy at first when they're doing this. And there's also the art to the S posture is being able to keep the S and also stay alongside the social partner while in the S. And typically the younger belugas make the S and then the other animal keeps swimming and they're not next to them. So eventually being able to make this S and stay next to that other individual. So it does develop in a piecemeal fashion over time, but we'll talk about in a minute, some individuals hit these milestones and are able to achieve these postures earlier in their lives than others. So a little bit more about the S posture, because S posture is a word not just in cetaceans, but also other animals that we sometimes talk about in aggressive or agonistic contexts. And that S posture is usually when the individual has their back arched or hunched. Bottlenose dolphins can be seen doing this. I did not put in an image of bottlenose dolphins, but DCP has posted about this on their social media. So you can go there, take a look at that bottlenose dolphin agonistic S posture. But we started describing S postures for sexual behavior because this very much looks like an S. And so when we were sort of thinking about S postures, wait a minute, S postures are often associated with agonistic or aggressive behavior. We started looking at some of the differences here. And so still in the process of completely documenting this, but what we've seen is that the shape seems to be a bit different for these two different contexts. And so in the sociosexual S posture, the genital region is much more towards that partner, the social partner. And that hump in the back, I mean, there's still a hump in the back, but it's much more up here near the head, the neck, the upper back area. And the focus here, you can see Oliver moving his melon here, is on the other individual. In comparison to this agonistic S posture, so there is a hunch in the back, it's lower, and that genital region is withdrawn up away from the other individual. And this is an interesting combination here, but we have many other examples where they're all facing different directions, but that hunch is definitely there. So the shape is a little bit different. The agonistic S posture tends not to last very long, and we also don't see them as frequently. Belugas tend to swim away more than they have confrontations, but it does happen. But we've seen a lot more of this sociosexual S posture. So I'm just pointing this out because I do think it's an important distinction when we mention different postures. Perhaps we need some different names for these, or we just need to be specific because if someone is evaluating welfare of a group or trying to interpret behavior of wild individuals, this could make a big difference. We've also looked at the social network analysis, sort of who's interacting with whom. And we've seen some patterns. So there are partners who interact more with each other versus less. And also the males tend to be more involved than the females. Well, this is just an example, a little excerpt of individuals who are definitely more central to the action and individuals who are more on the periphery. The females are in pink here, the males are in blue. We actually have a series of images in one of our papers here looking at, because individuals enter or leave the population, a few different snapshots here. But what we've seen is, especially in that sociosexual behavior, the females aren't as involved. They tend not to get involved in a lot of that behavior. And then the males, we have an interesting sort of pattern. So what we've seen is they tend to pick a partner, or they pick, but they engage in these animals or in these behaviors with partners who are slightly different ages, so older or younger. This is in contrast to what we found when, again, looking at this population, they've engaged in the mouth game. So the mouth game, if you've seen images before, the belugas are grasping onto each other's mouths very gently. They tend to engage in that game where they're grasping each other's mouths with a same aged partner or the most similar aged partner available. Whereas sociosexual partners tend to be age mismatched. at least to some extent. Maybe not the furthest away in age, but not the closest in age always. And that's very interesting. So again, we can't say exactly why that could occur, but we could maybe make some hypotheses why that might happen. So when we think about development and housing consequences, we've seen some patterns. And so one of those patterns is, in some cases, there's one adult male in the population and then maybe a calf in the population. They're engaging in sociosexual behavior sometimes with that individual, but it's a bit lower. The calf is still reaching those developmental milestones. So they'll still be able to do the S posture and the pelvic thrust and have an erection, and all of that is still occurring. But they're achieving that a little bit later in their development. And this is in contrast to when there's more adult male or subadult juvenile male potential partners. The calves are ending up engaging in sociosexual behavior at a higher rate, and also they're reaching those developmental milestones earlier in their life. So this brings up some questions about why are they reaching those developmental milestones earlier? Because there's potentially a couple of options and they're not mutually exclusive necessarily. So what are those potential options? How are the belugas learning their sexual behavior, or in this case, sociosexual? It could be that there's some non-social learning going on. There could be some innate components. Maybe there's some fixed action patterns, perhaps, where the belugas will, even if they were by themselves their entire lives, they would still develop some of these behaviors. That's possible. Obviously, that's not an ethical experiment, but it could also be that just as they have more opportunities for practice, they build up their motor skills, they build up their muscles, they build up their coordination. And just over time, by practicing and having those opportunities, they're able to engage in all of these behaviors. But as we've seen, belugas are very social. So it is possible that they are learning from their conspecifics. They could be engaging in imitation or emulation of their conspecifics. So watching another beluga do a behavior and then going and trying to copy that behavior or copy the end goal, whatever that might be of that behavior. It's also it's also possible that their behavior might be being shaped by the conspecifics social partners in the group. Now, to be very clear, it does not mean that the other belugas are teaching the younger ones. I mean, I suppose that could be happening, but we're not going to claim that yet. We'll see. But whenever social animals are responding to each other, that could change the behavior of the social partner. So, for example, we'll just go over our definitions of operant conditioning. This is how lots of species, including humans, learn things about life and how to engage with each other. When a response is favorable, or the partner responds in some way, that behavior, if it's more likely to occur again, that's reinforcement. If the other individual, the social partner, responds unfavorably, maybe in an aggressive or agonistic manner, and the behavior is less likely to occur again, that's punishment. So for example, we can suppose one of these younger individuals goes up to the adult male in the population. They turn and do some sort of sexual presentation or S posture towards the adult male. If the adult male reciprocates, allows the younger animal to stay there, to rub on him, to engage with him, that's a favorable response. It's likely that that younger animal, he's going to keep doing those behaviors. If the adult male turns and does an open mouth head jerk, an agonistic vocalization, maybe chases or tries to rake, which is very rare, a lot of raking, but it does happen with belugas. If that adult male turns to that younger animal and is somehow aggressive or agonistic, that might mean the younger animal is less likely to do that again in the future. And so, not that the adult male is trying to teach. Again, I cannot tell you what he's thinking, but maybe we'll know decades down the road what he's thinking. It's possible, though, by just his responses, he is shaping how that younger individual is learning these behaviors over time. And so this obviously needs a very intense, thorough look, but some of our evidence so far has revealed some pretty interesting interactions. And so one has actually been adult females engaging with juvenile males. Now, I said adult females typically stay out of it. They do. But on a number of occasions, we have observed adult females engaging with these subadult juvenile males as they become 7, 8, 9 years of age. And so in this image here, we have Samson. He is doing a sexual presentation towards Chrissy. This is the adult female. Chrissy is often, for calves that are not hers, Samson is not her calf. She often does in open mouth, little head jerk. She likes her space. And so she typically doesn't want other animals near her. But in this case, she stayed with Samson. Also very interesting here, Samson is producing bubbles out of his mouth and his blowhole simultaneously. So what happened next? Chrissy actually reciprocated this towards Samson. This video was quite long, several minutes long, but she reciprocated towards Samson. She is doing this S posture towards Samson. And then Samson was able to do a pelvic thrust here onto her side and make contact. So when I said we need to do a deep dive, pun intended there, into this, we need to know when Chrissy, but not just these two, but the other examples we have as well, when these individuals are responding, how is that changing or not changing the behavior of the younger animals? And this could be true of any dyad, but I think it would be specifically interesting to look at this very different age sex dynamic where Chrissy is a reproductive adult. So looking at how she's responding to some of these sexual advances from these younger males could be very interesting here. Now, we haven't just looked at sociosexual behavior. We're also interested in how the actual reproduction is working as well, and what actually goes into producing a calf. But this behavior is quite rare in terms of how many calves have been born in a professional care setting and how many of those conceptions were actually observed. Luckily, we have a few examples, and what we've been able to see and document from the few examples here is also what I find just fascinating, and we need to know a lot more about. And so in these few examples, the adult male in the population here at the time was doing an S posture, but he wasn't chasing or herding or swimming fast over to the female. He was doing an S posture at the very bottom of the habitat, hence the somewhat foggy nature of the images here with the best resolution we have. So he was doing an S posture at the bottom of the habitat. Now he was watching and sort of turning his body so that his ventral side, his belly, genital area was angled towards the female, but he was staying down at the bottom, some distance away from her. And this has happened with a number of pairs now. The adult female actually swam over to him. In this case, she positioned herself with her ventral up alongside him. In this case, with her dorsal up, her belly down alongside him as well. And so we need to know a lot more about the mating system of belugas and how they're choosing their mates. If they're mating with just everyone who's possible and available. If they're being selective, it's likely that if anything, the females might be more selective than the males. So is there some sort of female mate choice? That's what would be really interesting to know, given that the male wasn't chasing in this situation, like is often sometimes seen maybe in some other cetacean species, but the female actually swam over and stayed alongside him. In some cases, she speeded up. In some cases, she slowed down. So interesting, right? And why do we care? So with belugas, they seem to be very display based. So whether that's moving their melon shape on their forehead, or whether that's contorting their body. This visual display, now there might be important vocalizations that are happening too, but if this is very important for females to engage in mating behavior or to choose the male with the best fitness, how are females choosing which males are sexy? Are they just choosing based on body condition and size and how much blubber the males have along their sides? Are they choosing based on vocalizations? Are they choosing based on that body posture and how the male is approaching or not approaching? We have absolutely no idea at this point, but it's a really, really interesting area to investigate. And I think it's very interesting especially given the situation we have, for example, Cook Inlet belugas. They're endangered population, it's not recovering. It's difficult to study exactly what's going on there in terms of the social behavior because the Cook Inlet water is very muddy. There's a large tidal range there, and so the water gets stirred up a lot. So we can't see really, and the folks there can't see really what's happening a lot below the surface. But if we are going to hypothesize that the belugas are finding each other, choosing their mates, if the mate choice has something to do with being able to either hear each other acoustically or use echolocation to determine, body size, shape of that other individual, if there's a lot of noise pollution or a lot of boat traffic, those variables could very much interfere with what's happening behaviorally. Of course, in addition to chemical pollution and prey availability and all of those factors, right? So importantly, we have animal ambassadors to help us answer some of those questions. If we can better understand the mating system and how belugas learn these behaviors over their developmental lives, we can hopefully know a little bit more. And so one of those examples is Tyonek. So this is Tyonek. He was stranded in Cook Inlet, Alaska several years ago, and he was deemed non-releasable by the government. So he actually lives in SeaWorld of Texas now with a lot of the social partners that were in the pictures and the images and that we looked at today. And so he can help us learn more about his species. And of course, we've talked about Cook Inlet and the need to know more about belugas, but I think it's going to be especially important to know more about belugas in general. So this is the Arctic. The Arctic, as the sea ice melts, is opening up. People are going to start shipping through here and drilling, and just more and more human activity is going to be here. And so even though some of these other beluga populations might be stable and okay for right now, we need to know more about species before their habitats are impacted, and especially not only those, physical impacts, but the behavioral impacts and how that might affect the interactions that the belugas are having with each other. So not only that, we have lots of questions we need to answer in the future. So, I hope we can answer them all, but there's a lot to look at. So knowing more about, is female mate choice happening? What specifically is going on there? We've used this population as an example. Like we've mentioned, here's what we found with this population. But that doesn't mean that's happening with every population. Belugas, if they're a social species, could develop their own behaviors over time. So is blowing bubbles out of the mouth and the blowhole something that's unique to a specific population? Is that happening in other professional care populations? Is that happening in wild populations? With different stocks of belugas on different sides of the Arctic, we would need to know more about that. And then, like I mentioned, the shaping and the long-term effects of experience as these individuals are becoming sexually mature. Does that lead to greater reproductive fitness? That we need to know more about too. So a lot of what I've talked about is how we can study this long-term population, and it can help us learn something more about beluga behavior, which can lead to conservation. But I don't want to undermine the role all of this knowledge has in welfare. Potentially welfare for the individuals in the wild populations, but also the role for welfare of the belugas in professional care. The animals we've observed, again, have spent a large portion of their time engaging in socio-sexual. Of course, the sexual behavior is a little bit more seasonal dependent, but they're spending a lot of their time engaging with a variety of social partners, sometimes with a preferred partner. But the more dynamic the social groups are, the more socially engaged the animals tend to be. And socio-sexual behavior, although, the folks visiting accredited facilities, the visitors go, what are they doing? It's probably a very important component to their well-being, engaging with these others. Not only is it physically stimulating in terms of motor behavior, having to practice motor behavior, developing those muscle skills and coordination skills, but also the social skills. How to be a beluga, what's socially acceptable and what's not socially acceptable as a beluga, because that probably leads to potentially being an attractive mate choice later down the line. So if this is really important to belugas, considering the role that sociosexual behavior might play, often folks document the welfare of their animals with ethograms, monitoring how social they are, how maybe if there was aggression that occurred in a population. But I think it's also really important to keep track of what sexual or sociosexual behaviors occurring because it seems to be an important part of their life and likely contributes to their welfare as well. So that's my plug for why long-term and developmental studies are so important. We could get a snapshot from lots of different populations at very specific periods in time. But without this long-term study, looking at how different behaviors change and having baselines, it is hard to actually answer some of these questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to you for questions. If you have questions, I'd love to talk about it. If you have to leave for some reason, or if you're watching this recording later, you might want to just send me an email and we can converse that way. So I'll turn it back to Kel and we'll see if any of you want to chat more about belugas today.
Thank you so much for all of that info. Oops, sorry, I'm sharing the
That's
wrong
fine.
thing. And as usual, I'm just going to do our little wrap up and then we will get to questions. So as a reminder to anyone listening who's maybe new, this was a DCP webinar and recordings are posted online. So if you want to get those straight from our website, just go to dolphincommunicationproject.org, look in the Knowledge Hub, and you'll find the webinars there. This was a deep dive, so obviously Dr. Lilly wasn't shying away from technicalities and specifics. It's a little bit longer. We also have dolphin lessons which are shorter, a little more simplified. So while they're geared toward younger audiences, I think they're great for everyone. And then we also have our podcast, the Dolphin Pod, that you can listen to again straight from our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And then, of course, DCP is a nonprofit organization, so I would not be doing it any favors if I didn't remind folks how you can support the work we do. You can become a dolphin protector, which make great holiday gifts. We'll have some promos coming up. You can become a member, make donations. You can buy merchandise. You can join Dr. Kathleen in the field. You can support Stream to Sea, which make wonderful reef friendly sunscreen and other body care products, and just follow along, share social media posts, spread the word, stay in touch, bring up conservation topics among your friends when you're chatting, and all of those are great ways to support dolphins and therefore the conservation of the entire ocean. So with that, we have quite a few questions, so I'm actually not sure if we're going to get to all of them. And usually I try and find a way to like put them in a logical order, but we'll see how I did with this, Dr. Lilly. We'll go with some of the more isolated questions first. So someone noted that you mentioned about bubbles being released from their mouth. Is their anatomy different from, say, a bottlenose dolphin? Can you explain how they're able to do that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, probably could have simplified that by mentioning it earlier. So sorry about that. Yeah, so he actually would take water, or sorry, air, come up to the surface and take some air in his mouth and then go down below and blow bubbles out his mouth and out his blowhole. So no, the anatomy remains the same. So the only way they're going to get air in their mouth is to come up to the surface and grab some. Although I think there have been a couple species documented in the wild where they seem to maybe have their a different airway and mouth pathway, throat pathways crossed. So I think maybe some in the wild might do that. But as far as we know, this beluga's anatomy is very typical. He was just grabbing air from the surface.
Clever. Um, you emphasized very nicely, I think, for listeners, that this study was not a snapshot. So obviously reproducing it would take lots of commitment and funds and all of that stuff. But do you think it will be reproduced at, say, a different SeaWorld location, to compare groups that way?
Oh, great question. That will honestly depend on who is committed to that task. I will say there are some practical considerations and limitations. So one is just the populations of belugas in professional care. If we look at accredited facilities within the U.S., that's primarily my knowledge, so I won't go outside of the U.S., but other folks who are international might be able to provide more insight there. But for the most part, these populations tend to the animals that are here, they're here. They're kind of small, right? So SeaWorld of Texas has the largest beluga, most dynamic social group population. So it could still be replicated with smaller populations, but to look at the same extent, of course, the number of social partners would have to be taken into account and the number of young individuals. So something, and this will be shout out to Dr. Hill, that we've seen in the past research, it has been that the number of individuals of mixed ages, the younger individuals with the older individuals, the calves bring something to the table. They very much mix up the behavior of the adults. And so it provides a lot of social interaction opportunities that if there was an adult only population that potentially may not be occurring or may not occur with as high rates. Could it be replicated? I think there could be a few instances where it could be replicated. Obviously, starting from scratch, then it would take years. But I don't think it has to be entirely replicated in order to sort of provide some supporting evidence or maybe evidence to the contrary that this is different in different populations. And so even just talking with folks at different facilities, at conferences, some folks are able to say, oh, wow, we've seen that with our belugas as well. It's not documented, which for scientific purposes would be amazing. But just having those conversations about, oh, we've seen this very unique or interesting thing, or we saw this adult male and adult female this one rare time in the middle of the night, whatever, is able to add to our knowledge.
Thank you. Um, you showed that, and I think you said it was that Jackson did a lot of work on it, that cool spiral diagram.
Yeah.
And I don't know if how fast it would be. I could stop my share in case you want to pull it back up. But someone asked about comparing beluga development of beluga sexual behavior to other species. I think the question was kind of targeted toward a comparison to humans without being anthropomorphic. But maybe you could even touch upon comparing belugas to any other species, cetacean or otherwise.
Yeah, so having a specific comparative study would be really, really interesting. From a comparative psychology and then again maybe some of your biology standpoint, that's how we sort of set the baseline. We compare species to each other and say what's similar here and what's different. I think it would be a lot more feasible to look at sociosexual behavior in, for example, bottlenose dolphins, because there are very similar circumstances which we could sort of more easily compare. I think the human question might be quite difficult. One reason why a lot of this research is, I won't say like new, but it is newer. And as we said, the more we look, the more we find it, is because sometimes we take a very human lens when we're looking at animals and we interpret their behavior. So often, if belugas are engaging, or I don't know, the gray whales here are engaging in sexual behavior, sometimes people will often assume, well, that's a male and a female, they must be mating. But that's not always the case. Sometimes we're taking a human lens and maybe someone's own perspective and saying, oh, that's probably what's happening. And so actually a recent study was just published, Anderson 2024, and it actually surveyed people and said, you, as a person who studies animals, how often have you observed sociosexual behavior? And the biologists or psychologists who reported said, oh, I've actually observed it quite a lot, but no one's really publishing on it in our species, either because just it's not a priority, or because it's rare, or because we haven't seen it. So I think the more we sort of try to take away our biases about what we're looking at, the more we might see it. That being said, if we think about humans, we have a lot of rules and laws in our society about like what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And so I teach human sexuality course, and one of the things that happens is people just don't talk about sex for the most part in general, and especially not developmentally through teenage years and early childhood, what's going on there, right? So even if they're talking amongst themselves, like as a society, we don't really have those discussions. So I think it'd be very difficult to say, how is this similar or different to what humans are up to? Because a lot of what we're doing is again shaped by what we're allowed or not allowed to do or talk about. But for sure, other species, bottlenose dolphins would probably be the most feasible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think the next set of questions kind of lends itself to mix because they touch on wild research.
Mhm.
So anyone who knows me will know that this is actually my question. Do any of the wild populations, do they overlap with other similarly sized species, cetacean species? And if so, are there ever any interspecific sexual behaviors that go on?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so first of all, belugas, we can't see them most of the year unless you are a person who is trained to be in the Arctic year round, and brave some very crazy weather conditions. So first
Not.
we have yeah, me neither. Although, at some point for a short period of time, would love to do that.
Mhm.
Yes. So first of all, we're missing a big gap in like what the belugas are up to during a large portion of their lives in wild populations. However, we do have some evidence that they have been engaging in interspecies interactions. So narwhals are the closest living relatives to belugas. They're about the same size-ish and shape-ish, and they're the most closely related. And there is some evidence of some narlugas, or what are they calling them? I think they're calling them narlugas.
Mhm.
So there is some evidence there, and a couple aerial photographs of either a narwhal and a group of belugas or vice versa. So there is some interspecific interaction. It doesn't seem to be super prevalent, like maybe like the spotted dolphins and the bottlenose dolphins, maybe that you've studied before. It doesn't seem to be as widespread as that because they tend to be in, I guess, different areas. But there is evidence that they're sort of sexually compatible, so possible.
Thank you. Also or I'm picturing the wild with this question, with the, advent and improvement of drone technology, and photo ID, are the belugas different enough? Do they have sexual dimorphism? And so can drones ID sex in belugas, if you're studying them in those murky, cold waters?
Great question. Well, not being someone who does that, I will be careful with my response. But in theory, yes. So when they are, that's the trick though. You would have to know that you're looking at two grown adults because the females would be a bit smaller. The males have these um people call them bumpers or blubber rails along their sides and their foreheads, their melons, even around their blowhole tends to be a bit chunkier, blubbery looking. So they definitely are sexually dimorphic, but only if you know you're looking at an adult male and a female of some sort, because otherwise it could just be a juvenile male who looks similar to a female. I don't, does that make sense? Yeah. And then also with photo ID, there's definitely possible photo ID with belugas. They can get different skin markings. Rake marks do show up on their sides. They don't have a dorsal fin, so that sort of makes that a bit difficult. Their dorsal ridge can appear in different patterns, but obviously there's just less obvious markers. So photo ID is definitely possible, but I think it would be a little bit trickier to do on a very large scale, like some of the, very large scale studies with some of the other species.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I think there are a couple of questions, but I'm going to sneak one last one in, which kind of goes back to your observations. When you discuss the manipulation of the melon, is that more related to or an artifact of the vocalization, or is that its own thing that the beluga is doing?
Great question. We would love to know. Um, so the melon can be manipulated. Unlike again in bottlenose dolphins, it's more static. The melon is there. Their facial structure can't change as much. But in the belugas, their melon has a lot of different shapes it can take. It could be a visual display. It could be going along with the vocalizations that are there. It could be both, or there could be some sort of like overlap, mix of that. I think we're lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Richard today. And so just shout out to him, has recently published a paper. I say recently, I don't know, so within the last 2 years, on melon movement in belugas. And he can correct me if I'm wrong because there's space to do that in the chat. But it seems like their melon was moving in certain shapes when the other individuals were in visual eyesight of each other. That indicates that it's probably not just about the vocalizations, that it's probably also a visual signal. But there's many different types of vocalizations, and myself, our group has not studied vocalizations plus melon movement in exact contexts, specifically sociosexual. So we'll reserve that. But I think there's some evidence that's starting to be found, and would be great to look at it across different populations.
Very cool. Excellent. Well, I'm glad I snuck that question in. And thank you to the submitter, the and with that, I know we're kind of hitting that hour mark. So, and thank you, Dr. Lily, so much for your time. Thank everyone who's been listening live, everyone who's listening to the recording. And yeah, we hope that we see you again at another Dolphin Communication Project webinar. And thank you again, Dr. Lily. Hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye.